I know that some of you attended the autoimmune class I held last week. If you enjoyed that and you're ready to take your health to the next level, I want to share something new that we've created for you. For the first time ever, I'll be offering a live 7-week online workshop that will guide you through a step-by-step process of healing autoimmunity naturally using functional medicine and ancestral health principles. It starts on Monday, August 16th, and will run through the end of September. I'll be sharing the same approach and many of the same strategies and tools that I've successfully used in my practice when treating patients with autoimmune conditions. In short, I want to provide some of the benefits of working with me directly at a fraction of the cost. Here are just a few highlights of what you'll learn. The 6 root causes of autoimmunity and the 4 pillars of treating autoimmune disease from a functional medicine perspective. The best dietary approaches for autoimmunity and how to choose the right one for you. The role of gut health in autoimmune disease and how to heal your gut. The most important functional medicine lab tests and treatments for autoimmune disease. And the top supplements and herbs that I use in my clinic with autoimmune patients. This won't just be book learning. We'll give you the guidance and support you need to apply what you learn in the workshop in your own life so you can start feeling better and take back control of your health. For all of the details about this powerful program, including an outline of what's included in each of the 7 modules, go to kresser.co/autoimmune workshop. That's kresser.co/autoimmune workshop, all one word. One more thing before I sign off. We're offering a 25% early bird discount for the next few days only. So if you're planning to register for the workshop, make sure to do it before Sunday, August 8th at midnight Pacific time. That's when the early bird discount expires. I'm really excited about this workshop, and I hope you can make it. Just head over to kresser.co/autoimmune workshop to learn more and sign up. And do that before Sunday at midnight Pacific if you want to save $100 off the full tuition price. See you soon. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. You know, even though meat and other animal products have been part of our diet and our hominid ancestors' diet for at least 2 million years, they have been largely vilified over the past 50 plus years, at least in the industrialized world. And they've been vilified not just from the perspective of their nutritional impact, but also from the perspective of their environmental impact. And this second issue is primarily what I'm going to focus on today in my conversation with my guest, Nicolette Hahn Niman. She's a writer, attorney, and a livestock rancher, and is the author of the books Defending Beef, which was published back in 2014, and Righteous Pork Chop, which has to be one of my favorite book titles, back in 2009. She's also written several essays for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and other popular media outlets. The interesting thing about Nicolette, or one of the many interesting things, is she was a vegetarian for 33 years. She's actually recently started eat meat again, but even during the time that she was a vegetarian, she was an advocate for including animals in our food system. Because as you'll hear, she makes a pretty compelling argument that animals have to be included in our food system in order to have a healthy ecosystem. So that's primarily what we're going to focus on today. We'll talk about how ruminants are beneficial to biodiversity and restoring the environment, how regenerative agriculture can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and replenish soils, how farmers and ranchers can lead the effort to healing ecosystems and human health, and why an ecologically optimal food system contains animals. But we'll also touch a little bit on the nutritional impacts of animal products in the diet, which is, of course, a subject that I've covered in depth on numerous occasions. We'll talk about why animal fats and proteins are nutritious and provide vital nutrients for optimal health, and why a balanced, healthy diet should generally include some animal products, for most people. So this was a fascinating conversation for me. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's dive in. Nicolette, it's a pleasure to speak with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So I'm just going to dive right into, I think, one of the most interesting parts of your background and experience in this topic as an entry point, which is you, until fairly recently, I think almost over 30 years, were a vegetarian.
Yeah.
and yet one of the most vocal advocates for including animals in our food system. I think when a lot of people hear that, it doesn't fully compute. So maybe that's a good starting point for this conversation. Uh,
Yeah.
what is it, about animals being a part of the food system that led you, even as a vegetarian, to be such a vocal advocate for that to happen?
Well, I should say I was raised as an omnivore, by my parents, and
Mhm.
they were very focused on eating good, real food. And my mom did a lot of cooking and gardening, and we used to go out to the farms in the community in Michigan where I grew up and get a lot of fresh vegetables and fruits. But when I entered college, I was a biology major. I had already been really involved in environmental causes as a child, and then got very involved in the environmental community in the college I went to in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it was just kind of everywhere, this idea that if you really cared about the environment, you wouldn't be eating meat. And I remember at that time, especially, the focus was on this idea that hamburgers were destroying the rainforests of Latin
Yes.
America. And I just was already, I had always really felt connected with animals. And so it just kind of made sense to me that I should probably not be doing it as well as a responsible environmentalist. And there was also, of course, this idea out there that saturated fat was killing us, and therefore we
Mhm.
should not be eating beef because it contains saturated fat. And I became a vegetarian the summer after my freshman year of college, but I had already stopped eating beef like 6 months before that, because beef was the worst, right? This was
Certainly.
this was absolute, sort of the environmental orthodoxy, and I was kind of buying into it. And I became an environmental lawyer, years later, and was just working, for National Wildlife Federation. But when I was hired by Bobby Kennedy Jr. as an environmental lawyer, he wanted me specifically to work on meat industry related pollution. And I thought at first, well, this is, kind of fitting because I'm a vegetarian and I heard he think, meat is bad. I mean, I never accepted the idea that it was totally like morally wrong to eat meat. That was not part of my thinking, but I just had this idea that there was this bundle of problems associated with meat production and that it was kind of inherently part of meat production. And so when I began doing the work for Bobby Kennedy, it kind of reinforced my thinking at first. But and what we were really focused on was the pollution from large concentrated hog operations and large concentrated poultry operations and also dairies. And there's tremendous pollution and all kinds of other issues associated with that. So I initially kind of reinforced what I had already been doing for 10 years as a vegetarian at that point. But the more that I was kind of studying it and learning and talking to people and visiting farms, I was seeing that there was this really dramatic difference between different production systems. And I had been on small farms in Michigan growing up, so I knew that there were other ways to do things. And then I started visiting a lot of the Niman Ranch farms, which were in the network, a network of several hundred farms that were all doing things in sort of a more traditional way, basically grass based. And I not only started thinking, well, this is very different and we need to be making distinctions, but I got more and more intrigued by what I was seeing, that the good animal farming was actually environmentally beneficial and was producing a very different kind of food, and the lives of the animals were very different, the lives of the people were very different. The neighbors of the, what I'll just call the good farms, for purposes
Mhm.
of simplicity,
Yeah.
the neighbors loved the farms, right? In contrast to like the big concentrated industrial operations I'd been on in Missouri and North Carolina, where the neighbors were all, it was an embattled community, because of the presence of these industrial operations. So the impacts were so different. And so, even in that job at Waterkeeper working for Bobby Kennedy, I started to advocate within our group that we should be essentially meat advocates, for the good form of production. And years later, well, 2 years later, I got married to Bill Niman. I met him through the work, and he is the founder of the Niman Ranch Network and lived out in California already at that time. And when we got married, I moved out to this ranch, and for about 16 years, I lived and worked on this ranch where I'm talking to you from right now. and continued to be a vegetarian.
So
But
just to reiterate, you were living on a beef ranch, a ranch that produces beef and pork and a bunch of other animal products, and you were still a vegetarian.
yeah, and increasingly that started to feel, almost like a disconnect to me, because even though I was basically continuing eating as I had done, so I hadn't made a change, um, it felt more and more inconsistent to me, because I was more and more persuaded, not just that, you know, animal farming doesn't have to be bad for the environment, but I was more and more persuaded that it's actually an essential part of ecologically optimal food production. And I was also more and more persuaded that it's really beneficial for human health, to eat good animal products. And when I reached 50 years old, which was a couple of years ago, I decided to really try to evaluate my health and make sure that, I didn't want to, I was already realizing that as part of Kaiser Permanente network, that when you get 50, they start suggesting you should be on statins and, high
Right.
blood pressure medication. They
Yeah.
literally, I literally had that said to me by a doctor there. Well, you're about 50, so we should be looking at these, possibility of putting on statins and stuff. I mean, literally, that was the mindset, and about all about that. Obviously, you've written books about this. So, but it was just so shocking to me, and I started thinking, geez, if I want to make sure that I'm advancing through life, in the sort of, hopefully, the second half of my life, um, in a not just a okay way, not just limping into, older years, but really being vibrantly healthy, as I've tried to be my whole life. I better make sure I'm eating an optimal diet. And so I felt like it was no longer going to be okay to just say, well, I, once believed that it was bad for the environment. I don't believe that anymore, but I'm just going to stick with my diet, So
Mhm.
it was time for me to reassess. And when I had my bone density tested and I was told I had, osteopenia, the precursor to osteoporosis, that was one of those key moments where I thought, okay, I have to make sure I'm eating the best possible diet with real foods that are providing lots of nutrition. And then I decided to try to, after, shortly after I met with you and talked with you about this,
Mhm.
in person a couple of years ago, I decided to begin eating meat again. And it was, so it was something that I did with, I started with our own beef, and it was just delicious. And I felt, um, not just physically fine, but really good. But I also felt this incredible relief, because I realized I'd been kind of following a diet that was somewhat inconsistent with what I thought I should
Right.
be eating. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
thought, I was worried I would feel, some regret about starting to eat meat again or something. And it was almost the opposite. It was like this tremendous sense of relief, like a burden had been lifted from my shoulders, because I was no longer eating out of sync with what I thought my body should have.
Right. And your beliefs about the food system and what's important there. So,
Exactly.
I mean, I was as many of my listeners know, a vegetarian, even a vegan and raw food vegan for a period of time,
Hmm.
before I switched back to eating meat, and that transition was pretty seamless for me physically.
Yeah.
But that wasn't 33 years. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, and I imagine some of the listeners are too. How was that transition for you, going from no meat for all that time to meat? Was it difficult? Was it easy?
It
How
it
did it
was
feel?
it was shockingly easy. I was
Mhm.
just talking with someone over the weekend who was a vegetarian for 10 years, and she said, she had absolutely no ill effects from the returning to meat. And I said, that's my experience as well. I mean, because I know it is something of an adjustment for your microbiome and so forth. So I decided not to like start eating, like 2 pounds of meat a day or something.
Right.
So I just had like one piece of meat a day, or, I can't, I'm not sure in terms of the quantities, but it was certainly less than a few ounces. It was not a
Yeah.
large amount at first, but I did have a little bit of meat every day. And to be completely candid, I did not notice any ill effects. And
Hmm.
but in contrast to that, I did notice some really interesting positive effects. One of the things that led me to believe that I should try eating meat again was because for the 33 years as a vegetarian, I've always been super physically active, like, avid runner. I was a really avid triathlete for many years. I'm still avid cyclist and swimmer and all these things. And I was just always hungry. For almost 33 years, I was kind of like hungry all the time.
Yeah.
And I noticed in that first week that I started eating meat again, that I was not hungry anymore. There's like this immediate satiation that I had not
Hmm.
felt since childhood. And then the other really interesting thing is that I've always kind of struggled with craving sweets. And I've noticed, especially if I eat sweets, that I want to eat more sweets, like it kind of like that
Yeah.
sort of self-perpetuating cycle. But I noticed even just that first day when I ate the beef, it was the first time in I couldn't remember how long when I didn't want to immediately have a dessert as soon as I was done eating. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And I have noticed a really noticeable difference in how much sweets I am craving, how strongly I'm craving sweets, and how often I crave sweets, etc. And so, and I used to just feel like if I had a piece of fruit for a dessert, I felt that was inadequate. It was like, well, this was okay, but I really would much prefer something a lot sweeter. And,
Yeah.
and now it's kind of the opposite. I almost always will have, sometimes I'll have like half of an apple and a date or two and some nuts, like that's often like what I do for a dessert. Um, and dates are very sweet, so I usually just eat really small quantities of them, but I'll just eat like with a fruit, and it really feels really satisfying as a dessert to me now. And I often just don't have anything sweet after I eat a
Hmm.
meal, which is super interesting to me, because I did that for so many years, and it was it was almost like felt like a drug addict, like, okay, I have to have something sweet now, and I don't have that anymore. So that's been really interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I experienced something similar. Lots of my patients, as well. I have a lot of patients who were vegetarian or vegan and then started to eat meat again. And I think a lot of that comes down to protein. And I think particularly
Yeah.
animal protein being the most satiating of the macronutrients.
Yeah.
And when our body needs something, sometimes that need gets expressed in an indirect way. Or,
Yeah.
in other words, like if we're missing certain micronutrients, we might crave some, not necessarily, and that particular choice is closed down to us for various reasons. And we might try to compensate in other ways, and I think
Well,
that's
and
what's
you're
going on with
you're
the sugar.
you're just feeling that you're not quite done eating. You're
Right.
not
Yeah.
satiated.
There's
Like,
something missing.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you're kind of like opening the cupboard and going, well, there's some cookies up there.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're like trying to fill in for something that's not satisfied. And so that's been a fascinating thing for me, because
Hmm.
I did have this kind of nagging feeling for years that my diet could be better, even though I make tremendous efforts, and I have for many years, to try to eat real whole foods. But without meat, it was still, something I believe was lacking. And it now seems to have been largely, fulfilled. So
Yeah.
that makes me feel really good, just knowing that. And then I've just felt physically really good. And I do, weightlifting and Pilates and all this stuff. And I didn't do any Pilates during the lockdown because that was stopped. Actually,
Mhm.
my Pilates class just started up again a couple
Yeah.
weeks ago, but I started doing more weightlifting at home and all this stuff. And now that I'm eating meat, I'm not measuring it scientifically, so I can't prove this, but it feels to me like it's easier for me to build muscle and so forth.
Yeah.
Like I can
Yeah.
see the improvement in the things I'm working on pretty dramatically. And I'm convinced that having, again, the meat is making a difference for me in terms of I've got everything I need to build muscles. And as Chris, you're obviously extremely aware of this, but, for me, I was increasingly accepting this idea that after the age 50, I needed to work harder to keep that muscle mass, because it was going to naturally start being tougher to build and to keep. And then bone density, of course, is closely related to that muscle mass issue. So,
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I had the strong muscles, strong teeth, strong bones, have my framework all in good condition and keep it there, and maybe even improve it, not just view it as, okay, I'm I'm 50, so it's a downhill, slide for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
I really didn't want to do that. And so I personally am feeling like having meat in my diet again is really helping me chart a different path.
Great. Yeah, that's fascinating. Like I said, really in line with my own experience and so many patients that I've treated, and also with the
Yeah.
scientific literature, I
Yeah.
think. I want to switch gears and go back to something you said, which as a segue into talking about the environmental impacts, you said, you stopped eating meat for environmental reasons. And one of the, at the time where you did that, there was this pervasive idea that, um, beef is killing the rainforest in the Amazon. So let's talk about that, whether that's actually true. And then let's talk
Yeah.
about some of the other common reasons that you hear from, advocates of plant-based diets for not eating meat, like methane, and then, land and water
Yeah.
resources. And
Yeah.
then let's then move into an exploration of why animals are not only not harmful when they're raised in the proper way, but they're actually necessary and optimal for a food system.
Yes. That's a lot of ground to cover, but
It's a
yes.
lot of ground. We're
I
gonna
think
do
there's
our
a lot to talk
best.
about.
We're gonna do our best, and let's start with some of the misconceptions or the ideas that have been most promoted as an art, as part of the argument for switching to a completely plant-based diet.
Yeah, well, I just want to sort of quickly address the deforestation issue to start, because that's what you asked about first.
Yeah.
One of the most important things. You do it a great job in your writing and your speaking. You're always sort of making important distinctions in the health research, and it's kind of the same thing in the environmental side. All of these studies about agriculture, one thing, I've been on this ranch here in Northern California, north of San Francisco, where we're located. I've been here now for about 18 years. And I continue to be amazed at how site specific everything is, and how everything changes from year to year and even from day to day. And things are incredibly different on one part of the ranch from a different part of the ranch, let alone the ranch down the road, right? So one of the big problems with the research that's being used on all these kind of, these big splashy movies and reports that come out, is they always take very specific situations and then they generalize. So the deforestation issue is one of those examples. The Livestock's Long Shadow Report, which came out from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in 2006, erroneously, made the claim that they retracted it later and said this wasn't correct. But they originally, in their press release, when they released the report, said that the livestock industry actually caused more emissions than the transportation sector. And so that
Yes.
was, for global warming. And that was, later admitted by them to be false. But it attracted a lot of attention. And the main reason why their figure was so much higher than any previous estimates was they said 18% at that time. 18% of global warming emissions in the world were due to the livestock sector. But the main portion, the biggest chunk of that, 40%, actually was from deforestation and sort of clearing and burning that was taking place in a couple of very specific locations in the world. So Brazil was one of those places, and a few other countries around in some parts of Asia and Africa as well, but especially in the Amazon. And what they were doing is they were taking the figures of how much emissions were caused by the specific deforestation in those particular countries, and then they were generalizing it for the whole, industry. And
Mhm.
the absurdity of that, in and of itself, and I mean, I wrote an op-ed actually that was in the New York Times specifically in response to this at the time, which, if anyone's interested in looking at it, is called The Carnivore's Dilemma. But what I did is I sort of said, you really can't do that. It's not, sort of factually correct, and it's unfair, because if someone is raising cattle in, let's say Montana, they're, first of all, they're not in any way contributing to deforestation. Their cattle aren't contributing to deforestation, but in fact, the United States as a whole is reforesting. There's an increase in forested acres in the US. So there's really no connection. And there's also very, very little beef that comes into the US from the deforested parts of the world. And, specifically a lot of people like that, that thing that happened my freshman year in college when I was like hearing that, oh, your hamburger is deforesting the Amazon. That was
Right.
actually never true
Hmm.
because that beef actually doesn't come to the US. And even the soy that's grown, and this is another kind of footnote here, is that most of that land is actually being cleared primarily for the purpose ultimately of growing soy. And so there's a bit of an irony there, because if you're
Yes.
eating soy, you may well be contributing to the deforestation more than if you're eating beef. But
Right.
in the original edition of Defending Beef, I went through and sort of very specifically traced where the beef comes from that's in the US and where it's going, that's raised in the Amazon and the deforested areas, and where the soy is going. And I basically show that there's literally sort of no actual physical connection between those places. And the argument I make is that you're not going to be driving the deforestation by consuming beef if you're buying American, especially well-raised American beef, because you're actually bolstering the domestic supply chain by doing that.
Hmm.
And so you're actually, I would argue, diminishing the pressure on the Amazon when you do that. But more importantly, basically you're taking this very specific situation and you're generalizing it, and you're telling people that anyone who's eating beef is causing deforestation, and as just a matter of fact, that is not correct. So that's kind of on that deforestation issue. Now, similarly on land, you asked about the land and the
Hmm.
water. The land issue is also kind of another one that gets kind of into the absurdities. The way people talk about it is kind of absurd. So about 70%, you often hear that like 70% of the agricultural land in the world is being used by grazing animals. And that's always, said as this kind of like horrific figure. But the irony of that is that the vast majority of that is actually on what's referred to as marginal land, or non-arable, non-tillable
Right.
land, in other
You're
words, where you
not.
cannot graze crops. You can't do it.
Yeah.
It's either too hilly, too rocky, too windy, too cool, not enough topsoil, too dry. And actually, we happen to be on a ranch where I'm sitting right now talking to you. We're on a ranch that's a good example of this, because we're right on the coast. It's a very cool, very windy. In fact, today is a very windy day. And we're part of this Mediterranean climate where we only get moisture in the winter. So there isn't adequate heat at the time that you have moisture here. And there's, the topography is very hilly and rocky. So it's really a extremely poor place to grow any kind of food crops here. But since prehistoric times, this region that I'm in has had huge swaths of grassland. And the reason it's had huge swaths of grassland is, this was created by these ancient roaming, grazing herds going, way back to prehistoric times. There were either somewhere between 17 and 19 large mega fauna roaming in this area. So you had these large grazing animals, and then you had large predators, and a lot of people know about the elk that were here, but there were many other large grazing animals in these areas. And there were many large predators pursuing them. And these created these large grassy areas in Northern California, where I am, but also in many parts of the world. And so you always had areas that were large grassland areas that were sort of created and maintained by grazing animals. And the places where the domesticated grazing animals are, so the cattle, but also the sheep and the goats and the, bison and the other things that are being raised domestically for food around the world, they're almost entirely on those marginal grassland areas that do not really support farming, crop production. And we know from the Dust Bowl what happened in the United States in the early 20th century, when people did go into those, the Great Plains areas and started plowing. We had literally an ecological disaster. And that's actually what caused the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, the federal government, after that happened. But that's because the large grazing herds had been on those areas for thousands of years, and had created deep topsoil and deeply rooted, diverse, grasslands and pastures. And or I should say meadows, because pasture is more a term that's used when you're talking about agriculture, but essentially open areas that were created by grazing animals. And then when farming was brought there and the land was plowed, everything that had been built up there was very quickly destroyed.
Topsoil just blew away. Yeah.
Exactly. And the roots, all the roots that are below ground, most of the, especially all the plant species that populate grasslands are mostly below ground. The majority of the plant matter is underground. So there's a tremendous disruption that happens. All of those roots, those tiny root filaments, there's a whole subterranean ecosystem down there, and a lot of it's on a microscopic level. And so all of those roots are not just physically holding onto the soil, but they're creating little channels where water is contained, and there's a whole kind of substrate for interactions between the soil and the plant world that takes place on a microscopic level, where carbon is brought in from the process of photosynthesis, and nutrients are given to the plant in exchange for carbon that the plant gives to the soils. And so there's an amazing sort of subterranean very bustling economy down there, is how I always think of it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you plow, you destroy all that. But so you have these amazing grassland ecosystems around the world. That's where the grazing animals are. It's not where farming, in some cases, you literally can't do farming, like on our ranch here.
Yeah.
And in other places, like in the Great Plains, it's a place where you probably shouldn't have been doing farming.
Right.
But so there's this myth, this idea that grazing animals are taking up all this valuable land, that they should be, where you should be growing plants like lentils and soybeans that we could eat, and it's much more efficient. Well,
Right.
I think that whole thing is very upside down. That's a very upside down way of thinking about it, because what they're actually doing, these animals are actually taking sunlight and rainfall and naturally occurring vegetation, and they're converting it
which we can't eat.
We can't eat those things, and if we tried, we would die. We try to subsist on they're highly cellulosic, grass especially. It's just basically cellulose. There's very little nutrition in it, but because the ruminant animals have these sort of miraculous digestive systems that allow them, with this tremendous host of microflora that they have in their digestive tracts, they're able to convert it into nutrition. And that's kind of an extraordinary thing that they can do this. And because they can do that, they can exist on these marginal lands where we cannot or should not be raising other types of food crops. So that's just a total misunderstanding, in my view, of land use and agriculture and sort of ecology.
Here's the question about that. So the example you gave earlier of the FAO report, which I'm very familiar with, which extrapolated from a couple of areas in terms of the level of deforestation that was happening, and then assumed that same level of deforestation is happening everywhere that beef is produced. And then you have this situation where the statistic is thrown around about what percentage of farmland animals take up, which is totally misleading, because it's not arable farmland that we're talking about. It's all land. So I have to believe that the people who are using these statistics are smart and educated and aware of, and understand the science that they're talking about. So do you think this is intentional deception that's based on an underlying agenda? Is it just groupthink, where the same thing gets repeated over and over, and so people just keep repeating it without even questioning it or thinking about it? Just wondering if you have any insight into this, like based on your time as an environmental lawyer and working even kind of on the other side, so to speak, and like what's going on here? Why does this keep happening?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. In fact, I've never been asked that question before. But it's a really good question. I would have to say, because I've been, working on this stuff for literally almost exactly 20 years now. And so I've interacted with tons of people, and I come from the environmental nonprofit community myself. Right. So I was there, and I had those peers, and I was part of it. And then I've been interacting with people at Sierra Club and NRDC and everybody around the world for many, many years now. So I think I have a pretty good handle on the perspective. And I would say this, first of all, I would say to a shocking degree, the modern environmental agenda from the modern, existing environmental NGOs around the world is urban driven. So I think there's actually, because, the population centers are urban,
Yeah.
the money is urban. And so there's more and more just acceptance of this idea that, kind of we're gonna come up with our agendas here in this big city, like San Francisco or New York or wherever, and then we're gonna kind of we're gonna go with that. We're not gonna sort of try to figure out whether this is actually true out on the land. And in fact, I had a kind of a revelation about that, because I noticed that Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy and Point Blue, the conservation group Point Blue, which are all very pro ranching and pro
Mm.
cattle, shockingly to some people. These are actually groups that are actually kind of out in the field. They're doing tons of actual work, studying bird populations, for example.
Yeah.
And, really, they have a ton of people literally out in the fields all over the country and in different parts of the world, studying what's happening with habitat and all these kinds of things. And all of those three organizations have all made major efforts to partner with ranching and ranchers, because they've recognized them. It's not just that the ranching community has, kind of has control over a lot of land, and so we have to try to make good with these people. It's that they actually recognize them as kind of indispensable partners
Right.
in restoring bird populations and in improving soil and improving biodiversity. And
What's
so it's
good
a
for
very
herds is good for birds, right?
yes,
I've
what's
heard
good for
that
the herd is good
saying.
for the bird.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's and I kind of had this moment of epiphany on that a couple years ago, where I was like, what the hell is wrong with Sierra Club? Because actually I used to be a big fan of Sierra Club, and I worked with a lot of the folks at Sierra Club. But what I realized is that the people that I'd been working with for several years, when I was like at Waterkeeper Alliance, for example, they came from rural areas and from farm families, and none of those people were there anymore. They weren't at
Mm.
the organization. Like it was becoming more and more an urban centered organization, and urban dominated in terms of the perspective and the viewpoint on it. So
So
it's it's also part of this, Chris. One more thing I want to quickly say, and this is, if you're sitting in a big city and everything around you, you're in this industrialized environment, and everything around you, the cement and the metal and the glass and the fossil fuel emissions that are just going all around you, right? But the cattle are way far away, and it's like you can just point your finger way out into the countryside and say, God damn it, those people out
right.
there are causing climate
Right.
change.
It's not me
You know what I
driving
mean?
my car around and generating all this electricity and doing all the things I do in my urban lifestyle and flying my jet around the world to talk about how bad meat is for you, which is,
Exactly.
some people do.
Exactly.
It's easier to point the finger. That's interesting, and I hadn't thought about that distinction in those terms quite as clearly. And I still have to think, like, when that report is being put together and whoever is responsible for that is making that extrapolation of, like, okay, this is how much deforestation is happening in Brazil, so let's just assume that's what's going on in Bolinas or Montana or any other place. They have to know that that is not correct. So
Well, I have an
or
interesting,
it just, like, their eyes glaze over and they go into kind of autopilot mode. I don't know what's going on there, but there's
well,
something
I
really disturbing about that.
there interestingly, the lead author, his name is Henning Steinfeld, actually, of that report, was here on our ranch. He visited here a few years ago because he was doing a guest stage or whatever at Stanford. And
Mhm.
so he came here with another Stanford professor and toured our ranch, and we had a long conversation with him. And he basically said to me on that day when he was here, I think what you guys are doing here is great. And essentially, I have no problem with it. But I think the overall food system needs to move towards a more intensified system where we have, the animals in kind of inside buildings, like more towards pork, concentrated poultry. And that's why, and I think the extensive systems around the world that are, in areas, especially like in Africa and Latin America, he just saw that as problematic, and that we need to be pushing towards this quote unquote white meat because of that. But I thought it was really bizarre that.
So is that the just to make sure I'm understanding what his argument was, is that understanding, was it something like, well, this is really nice what you're doing here, but it's kind of boutique and we can't really feed the world with farms like this, and
Yeah,
we have
it's
to move
not.
toward these intensive operations if we really want to feed the world?
Yes, and to say essentially, we're not going to be able to get, what most of the beef cattle production around the world looks like right now. We're not going to be able to get it to look like this.
Yeah.
Therefore, the better solution is to intensify it. That's why it's so funny to me when I hear the livestock slung shadow report being used over and over again, like as kind of the core of the Cowspiracy movie, for example, because it's so absurd, because their solution is veganism. And he was actually saying, no, you need more intensification.
Right. That
You know what I
they're
mean?
actually, there's not enough calories and nutrients in a vegan, and there've been FAO's issued a report about that as well, that in many parts of the world, there's not enough nutrition in that
Yeah.
diet to be able to adequately feed people. And you have to add animal products to it in order for it to be viable.
Well, and in fact, that whole question of, especially in the developing world, so much of the high quality nutrition comes from the grazing animals. And so
Yes.
to me, it's almost a crime against humanity to be arguing that humans shouldn't be eating these kinds of
Yeah.
foods. I mean,
It's
they're
it's
sitting
it
there.
ignores these huge geographical class income equity differences, and to assume that they're just going to be going down to Whole Foods and buying tempeh or something,
Yeah.
you know.
And then it's telling all of us that we should be eating processed foods, basically, instead of
Yeah.
real whole foods that come basically directly from the earth. And that is
Mhm.
incredibly problematic as well. So it has, like, to me, there are all these things. Did you want me to address the water
Yeah,
issue as
well,
well?
let's talk about water and methane briefly. I mean, each recognizing that each of these topics could easily be entire pod, and has been actually entire podcasts, and debates and
Exactly.
things like that. But like, I just want to at least touch on the big ones. Like, so methane. Well, let's talk about water first, since we just covered land, and then let's go to methane. The idea that cow farts are the main cause of global warming.
Yeah. Well, the water thing is really interesting because, again, it kind of gets lumped into this big, and I was a water quality I mean, that was kind of my specialty when I was working as an
Mhm.
environmental lawyer. And the group Waterkeeper Alliance is primarily focused on water quality issues. So it was really, a big part of the work that I did. And I think it's important, first of all, to make two kind of distinctions. One is water quality and one is water quantity. So they're very different issues. Are you talking about the impact that it's going to have on pollution, or are you talking about whether or not you have, water in the ecosystem, or if you're using up too much of it, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So on both fronts, beef kind of gets, I think, unfairly um, vilified. And on the quantity issue, especially, you often hear that water, it takes up too much water. So what I did in defending beef is I actually looked at the studies where they actually tried to quantify how much beef, how much water is required to produce a pound of beef. And what I found was that virtually every analysis that's ever been done of it was not really done in a very agriculturally sound way, except for one that was done by UC Davis, which of course is a very credible agricultural school. So these are people who really understand, how things are done on an agricultural side. And what they basically, and I should make clear, the reason that these other studies or analyses, they were not really studies for the most part, were kind of so inaccurate, was they were taking all of the water that goes into the animals. So like we were just talking about, you have these grazing animals on the marginal lands all over the world, and they're consuming vegetation that's naturally occurring and watered by rain. Okay. And that water is being counted in these, hamburger statistics, right? These huge numbers that you hear all the time. But what the UC Davis people did was they actually said, okay, let's actually just look at how much water is actually added, how much is, like, let's say, irrigated or given to an animal in a water trough, right? So water that's in the system that, not water that's, sort of would be falling from the sky and landing on the
Yeah.
vegetation anyways. Okay. And there's kind of this green water, blue water, gray water distinction that's out there. But anyway, so this blue water is the stuff that you're actually sort of giving it to the animal to drink in the trough, for example, or irrigating crops with. And when you did that, when the UC Davis scientists did this, and they actually, even looking at conventional modern beef that is in a feedlot, they found that the water consumption level was about the same for beef as it is for rice. So rice, we know, rice is a comparatively to some other foods, a relatively water intensive food. But if beef and rice are about the same, and it's also comparable to several other things in a typical, modern pantry. But if that's true, why do we always hear about this with respect to beef, right? And we almost never hear about it with respect to other foods. And so my point isn't that that there isn't water that goes into beef production, but the point is it's really not so out of whack, right, compared to other things that we eat. And the other side of it, on the sort of the agricultural side of what happens to, again, that sort of water that's in agriculture, that, with these animals, what is their impact? I make a very important argument in the book. I think that when you have well-managed grazing systems, especially, having those animals on the land actually makes the water function better in that, the hydrological system is going to work better on that landscape. So you're going to have more water retained in that ecosystem than you otherwise would. So I would argue that the water question is a lot more complicated, because you're actually improving the soil's water holding capacity by having the grazing animals on there. And that hydrates everything in that ecosystem. Whatever else is growing there, whatever else is living there, in terms of wildlife or any domesticated crops or anything. And so I think the water question is just a lot more complicated than people tend to realize, and the numbers are a lot smaller and a lot less, concerning than people believe.
Well,
And on the
nuance
pollution,
and complication don't really do well
no,
in the media. It's like
no,
we need
it's
a simple headline that people will click on, and
exactly.
so
I mean, it's the reductionism and the oversimplification nowadays is just sometimes really, really disheartening. But
yeah,
and that's why I love podcasts, because we get to have longer
that's
conversations,
right.
and we get to dive deeply into these things. And I just want to say quickly too, on the water quality side of this, again, you can look at examples of where either dairy production or beef production are contributing to pollution, but the overall effect. So that's just a sign of poor management, because if you have well-managed grazing animals, it actually improves water quality, because it's not just that there's more water that's being held in the soils, but any water that's coming off of that land is actually going to be cleaner because of the natural purification systems that happen, the natural filtration systems. And I describe some of the research that's been done on that in my book. And so that's just something that's been studied in a bunch of different venues. And they found that having, and it's basically because you have, with grazing, you maintain dense vegetation and healthy soils, and all of that leads to filtration that happens as water moves through the system. And so it's actually a net benefit to have grazing animals in it for water quality. But again, it's a kind of that, it's not the cow, it's the how thing again. If you have to have well-managed grazing. So I think, to me, that's the bottom line over and over again, is the focus is on the wrong thing. We shouldn't be saying no cattle. We shouldn't be saying, beef is bad. We should be saying we need to improve how we're doing things, right? And
Right.
when we do good grazing, it has tremendous beneficial effects. So let's focus on improving the quality of grazing. There is some incredibly good grazing going on out there in the world, but there's a lot of bad grazing too.
Right.
So let's focus on the bad stuff. And then there's a lot of mediocre grazing, right? So let's make the mediocre stuff better, and let's make the good stuff great, and that's where I think the energy and the resources should be.
Well, I think the implicit assumption here too, with advocates of plant-based diet, is that we can simply remove animals from the food system and that will have no negative effects, right? And
Yeah.
that I find that in conversations with people about this, that is the assumption, whether they're aware of it or not.
Yeah.
And there's little understanding of what the very complex relationship is with animals in the food system, both from a environmental perspective and a nutritional perspective. And
Right.
from the nutritional perspective, I mentioned just now that there've been some recent reports that have looked at like, well, what would happen if we removed animal products from the diet, and people are already eating too many calories, and they may not be able to get enough micronutrients for the amount of calories that they need to take in to meet their nutritional needs. And so that's like a downstream effect that plant-based diet advocates often don't speak about. And then from an environmental perspective, it's like, oh, well, let's just stop producing beef then. And animal products, that's easy enough. And then we'll just make more corn, soy, and other
Wheat.
plant-based wheat
Yeah.
monocrops, and that will
Yeah.
have no impact
Right.
environmentally. Right? That's the assumption, right? That's not going to have any impact at all. And
I
so,
know. And
what's wrong with that line of thinking?
yeah, well, I mean, a big part of the problem is this issue of the marginal lands that we were talking about before. First of all, you actually physically can't produce food on so many of these places. But
Yeah.
also there's the type of food that you can, meat, if you take it out, it's not just about the flesh of the animal, it's also about the fat. I mean, one of the things I did this really interesting, I chaired a panel at the Sustainable Food Trust conference, the True Cost of American Food, a couple of years ago in San Francisco. And we put this amazing panel of people together that showed that we talked about the fact that animal fats had essentially been, really seriously vilified for, decades in the, sort of in the Western world.
Yeah.
And because of that, people had migrated towards vegetable oils, and specifically palm oil. And we talked about the implications of that from an ecological perspective, and it was shocking. We got this unbelievable collection of people together that knew that the really specific on the ground effects of the huge palm farms that were happening in Southeast Asia and things like that. And it was really, even for me, I've been working on this stuff for a long time, it was kind of mind-blowing to think about this. And so we talk about, for example, oh well, we shouldn't eat animal fats, something that I basically largely disagree with that idea altogether. But even if you buy into that's a good thing to do from a health perspective, well, how do we get those fats then? And the way that fats have been created when we migrate away from animal fats, which by the way can be local and can be from, and they're essentially non-processed for them, they're not industrially produced. They're very simple to get, and you can get them from your local farmer or butcher, or in our case, from our own ranch. And these oils are coming from, huge monocrop cultivation and from far, far away, and plantations, in the case of palm oil, for example. So all of these things that you're replacing, the meat and the animal fat with, that those things have costs. And in some cases, these costs are much worse. And in most cases, they're out of sight. So, this Patrick Holden, who's the executive director of Sustainable Food Trust, had come up with this great phrase, we're living off of the fat of their land. Because we stopped eating the fats of our own animals. And now we're going to places like Asia and other parts around the world and kind of destroying ecosystems in order to create the fats that we want to replace the animal fats with. It's pretty shocking. And very few people are even thinking about that at all.
Well, you can, grow more nuts, for example, and more avocados. Those are very energy intensive crops. But that, I think the solution that's really being proposed is more soybean oil, more, more cottonseed oil, more safflower and sunflower oils, essentially more industrial waste oils,
Exactly.
which are cheap. But of course, these don't have the same nutritional impact or benefit that eating whole foods that have naturally occurring fats in them do.
Yeah, and I hadn't really thought about it until I did this panel, but this whole idea that you're sort of becoming less and less able to feed yourself, right? When you start using all these industrial products as your staples, right?
Yeah.
And if it's okay for you to just render, as I always do, I render the pork fat, I render the just in my own kitchen. I mean, I'm not talking about like some big industrial process. I just do this in my own kitchen. Whenever I have a fatty cut of meat, I render the pork fat, I render the beef fat, and I literally just keep it in a little pot that I have sitting on my counter in my kitchen. And I use that for cooking for months afterwards. And so I don't have to get, some industrially produced and industrially processed oil that was grown up in northern Canada or something. You know what I mean? Or worse, something farther away and had to go through more steps and a giant monoculture with tons of chemicals on it. So yeah, it's a weird thing how we've shifted the way we eat, and we continually think that if we take the animal out of the equation, we're somehow improving it from a health and environmental perspective. And more, I'm just, sort of peeling back all the layers of the onion on this. I'm finding it to be just less and less true. And that if you want to feed yourself and eat really nutritious foods and eat whole foods and not be and trying to get locally things that are sort of biologically vibrant food still, those things are animals are a big part of that, right? And if you try to eliminate animals entirely from your diet, you're going to get more and more into the processed foods and the distantly produced foods that you don't know what it even looks like in terms of how it was raised. And that to me is inherently part of the problem.
So the bad news is we're running low on time. The good news is I think we have talked a lot about why animals are part of an optimal food system as we've addressed some of these myths about animal products, including them in your diet. So last thing I want to talk about is the significance of methane from cattle.
Yes, I'm glad we're going to have
this is obviously
a
like
talk about methane.
If you ask 100 vegetarians on the street that are vegetarians for environmental reasons, what the reason is, methane would probably be one of the things that comes up most, right?
Yep.
So let's definitely touch on that.
Yeah, I'm glad we have a little time to talk about it, because it is, as you say, a very commonly mentioned issue. But I think, again, it's really misunderstood. So first of all, again, so the global picture is really different than the domestic picture. And there are these fluctuations in methane levels that have been happening, and the scientists really don't understand that much about why. But if you're talking, especially in the United States, the methane emissions in the US are down almost 20% over the last about decade and a half. And this is in spite of the fact that there's all this methane that is now being shown to be caused by fracking. And fracking has dramatically increased. And we know that in fact, Congress just a few days ago decided to take up this issue again in terms of the uncapped methane leaks that are happening all around the United States and fossil fuel production. So we know there are a bunch of new sources and old sources that haven't been addressed in methane, and we're still seeing a decline in methane emissions. So I think one of the things is that people should just understand that, this idea that there's just kind of more and more methane that we're responsible for because we're eating beef. There's a real question and a real doubt about just even whether or not there's even a kind of a growing problem. And related to that, it's important to know that Dr. Miles Allen, who's at Oxford, a physicist at Oxford University, who is one of the scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that makes kind of the global recommendations about climate change. He's on a whole campaign, written a whole bunch and doing a lot of speaking about how the methods for measuring methane are completely wrong. And that they created this metric about 2 decades ago in order to sort of make equivalents for methane and carbon dioxide, and that it's actually incorrect. And I spoke with him directly when I was in England and have heard him speak and listened to a bunch of his podcasts and read a bunch of his papers. And basically what he's saying is, there's a historic load of methane, and that if you have continued methane emissions, you will basically just be replacing the existing methane that is in the environment, because methane does not accumulate. CO2 lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. And so essentially there's a kind of a certain amount that just you just keep adding. Anytime you emit CO2, it actually adds to the amount that's in the atmosphere. That isn't true with methane because it only has a life in the atmosphere of about 10 years. And so what Dr. Allen is saying is what you're really trying to measure is how much global warming you're causing when you do emissions. And if you have static methane amounts that you're releasing in any ecosystem, you're not going to increase the warming at all. It's going to be static. And in fact, he showed, he did all these explanations in his talk that I saw him do in England. And he showed that even with a slight decline in methane emissions, for example, he was talking specifically about cattle herds. He said, even if you had a slight decline, you would actually have a cooling or zero effect or cooling effect on global warming. So this idea that the cattle herds of the earth are this huge problem is just inherently untrue. The science, it doesn't match up with the science of what's happening in the real world as far as how these gases actually function. And he told me as well when I talked to him that he's very frustrated at all the attention that's being focused on cattle because he said everybody knows the real problem is fossil fuels. And
Yeah,
it's
transportation.
exactly, going back to the transportation sector and, so many other things. I mean, even food waste, on the other end of the, the sort of the food production system, there's a huge percentage of the world's methane that's caused by food that's rotting in
Decomposition.
the decomposition that's taking place in landfills. So there are all of these other really important components of, things that, for example, there's no good that comes from methane leaks, right? There's nothing good. Nothing good is produced, not even, an airplane trip or a car ride. There's nothing good. It's just something that is causing a problem and it needs to be fixed. And everybody in, the sort of scientific community is very aware of this. But the advocacy community that doesn't want people to be eating beef and doesn't want people to be, to think it's okay to consume beef has, kind of glommed onto this idea that because of the enteric emissions of methane from cattle, that you should stop eating beef. And it's really kind of nonsensical. So I go through the methane issue in a lot of detail in my book, Defending Beef. And I hope that, if people read it, they'll get a lot more. Those are just the bones. What I just gave you, those bones of it.
Right.
But I think it's the key point is that the methane, it's not a showstopper, like people, it's almost kind of a red herring. And it's, to me, it's more a tool that's being used by advocates that don't want us eating meat.
Which again goes back to the question of like what's happening there, because all of the science that you just explained is readily available. A lot of the stuff doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you really look at it. So you have to wonder, like, I mean, personally, I'm just fascinated by these questions of like, why do we believe what we believe, and what are our human biases, and how do they work against us, like confirmation bias, where we only seek out information that supports our viewpoint and we don't look at anything that might interfere with it. And it's so clear through this conversation and so many others, like how much that is harming us, how much our natural human biases get in the way of us finding the truth, especially when the truth is complicated, as it often is, right?
Exactly.
It's like we want, and this is understandable from an evolutionary perspective, we want to reduce everything to something simple because just cognitively, that's less expensive, right? That's a less energy intensive process. If we think about, we have to think really hard about something and explore a lot of complexity. That's from an evolutionary perspective, that's what's referred to as an expensive activity. And we want to reduce expensive activities as much as we can. So we have a tendency to make things way simpler than they actually are by creating these heuristics and these kind of soundbite ways of talking and thinking about things. So I'm so glad that you have taken the time to break all of this down. You originally published this book back in 2014. So maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit about why you decided to do a second edition and what's different in this second edition than the first one that you published 7 years ago.
Yeah, well, I first wrote it because I kept having people say stuff to me like, oh, well, I do eat meat, but not beef because,
Right.
beef is kind of the
Because
most
chicken is
problematic.
better. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And I was like, oh my God, no, I've
Yeah,
been
you
in
got
both
that
poultry
backwards.
houses.
Yeah. If you
Yeah,
ever, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I just was like, I kept having this weird upside down conversation with people and thinking, wow, I gotta use the things I've learned and the things I've seen and the things, that I'm doing here on the ranch and stuff, and just kind of lay it out as I see it and make the case that actually, if you're really only going to eat one meat, it actually should be beef. I actually
Beef,
believe
not
that.
chicken. Chicken should be at the bottom of the list,
Right. Chicken should be
probably.
the first thing you
Yeah.
get rid of.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Yeah.
and by the way, I think chicken's great too. I've been eating, we have this wonderful friend who raises pasture-based chicken, and
Yeah.
I've been eating a lot of it since I started eating meat again, and it's delicious. So I
But
love
it's harder
chicken
to
too.
find that. It's harder to find a truly pasture-raised chicken. Like if you're going and shopping in the grocery store, you're
Yep,
probably not able to find that, but you can find truly pasture-raised beef in most grocery
exactly.
stores now.
That's right. So
Yeah.
it exactly. I think like with a little effort, you can find really good chicken out there too.
Yeah.
But beef is easier to find good beef. It's easier to find totally grass-based beef. And I know you've talked about this in a lot of other podcasts, but
Yeah.
there's really good evidence that there are tremendous nutritional benefits to eating grass-based foods, truly
Yeah.
grass-based
Yeah.
foods. And so there's that. But to me, a few things to answer your question about why I wanted to do this again. Now, I was actually asked to do it by the publisher, and I jumped at the chance. I was thrilled. And they said, we feel this topic is more topical than ever. And I said, yeah, I do
Hmm.
too. So I was thrilled to. And I actually I went through the book line by line and spent, almost a year rewriting it, because there were a lot of subtle shifts I wanted to make to the book. I didn't know that when I started, the process, but as I went through it line by line, I realized like, oh, this isn't quite what I think anymore. Not that I find the original book to be inaccurate, but I'm just much more focused on this question of processed foods versus real whole foods now than I was when I
Yes.
wrote the first book. So there's much more of an emphasis on that and the importance of beef as part of that stable of real whole foods that you can, build a very healthy diet on quite easily. And just there is a lot more science and a lot more discussion, a lot more resources available on the question of carbon sequestration. We haven't talked that much about soil today, but I have a lot in the book about soil health, and there's a lot more discussion on that. There's been a lot of studies in recent years about soil biology and soil health. And this whole question of methane, a lot of good additional work has been done in the scientific community. So I really beefed up the discussion. I had to do that pun at least once.
Couldn't resist.
You gotta forgive me. So I beefed up a lot of the discussion in the climate change section because I thought that needed more, because a lot of stuff needed to be refuted and added to. And so I updated it, added and expanded things, and changed the emphasis. But I have to say, it's essentially the same book, but to me, it's a much more updated, much more expanded, and greatly improved book. So I'm excited that it's a super hot topic right now, because I think this is going to add, I'm hoping my book will become part of the public discussion where we can get through some of the sound bites and
Yeah.
get into
Yeah.
more meaningful discussions about healthy food systems and just being more connected with the natural world. I just think that's such an important part of humanity getting to a healthier place than we are right now. And I make the case in the book that, for the humans and for the animals and just everything, beef are a really important part of our food
Hmm.
system and of our landscapes. And I just want to make the case that we really need these animals. They're a very important partner to humans, and this book gave me the opportunity to put that out there, that idea out there.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I do see some positive signs, I think, thanks in part to your work and the work of other people who are sharing a similar message. It's not unusual now today. I mean, we've got lots of farm to table restaurants, for example, that are
Yeah,
serving beef, grass-fed beef, and bone marrow, and even organ dishes. And there's even there, more young people that are actually choosing to go into pasture-based farming and
exactly.
raising
Yep.
animals. And there are people who are environmentalists now who actually are advocating for the use of animals in the food system, whereas maybe 30, 40 years ago an environmentalist wouldn't be caught dead doing that.
Exactly.
I think
Yep.
there are some really positive changes, and I'm even though I can get discouraged and frustrated by the level of dialogue on these issues in the
Yeah.
mainstream, I think that we have made progress overall, and it's thanks to your work and the work of many others in this field. So the book is Defending Beef. And Nicolette, do you have a website or social media that you use to talk to people if they want to follow you and stay in touch with you and
Yeah.
your work?
We do have a very active Facebook Defending Beef and a Twitter Defending Beef. So
Great.
that's the best way to get a hold of me. And the book is coming out in July 20th, I believe.
Great. July 20th. Check it out. It's a phenomenal resource. I have I read the first one when it came out, the second one as well. And it's just, you'll be so much better informed on these topics if you read this book, and your information will be evidence-based, which is really
Yes.
what we want to get to here, instead of just the common refrains that we hear about in the media on both sides of the topic, because I think, to be fair, sometimes the paleo or ancestral health community can have the same tendency to oversimplify and to not be, to fully acknowledge and recognize the nuances and the complexity of some of these issues. So
Yeah.
I think that's the way we're going to make progress, is really dealing with facts and being as objective as we can about those facts, and then working towards understanding what the needs are and working towards a system that better addresses those needs for everybody.
Agree.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Keep sending your questions in to chriskresser.com/podcast questions, and we'll see you next time. The COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc on our institutions, our society, and almost every aspect of our lives. Yet within each crisis is a silver lining, an opportunity to reinvent ourselves, to discover a new path, and to take a leap of faith into the life we want to live. I know from speaking with a lot of you that this includes finding more meaningful and rewarding work. COVID has shown us that life is too short to do work that doesn't make us come alive and allow us to contribute to a better world. If you enjoyed this episode and you're interested in the topics we discussed, you might want to learn more about the profession of health coaching and what it has to offer. We've put together a resource page that explains what a health coach is. Hint, it's probably not what you think. How training as a health coach can change your life as well as your future clients' lives, and an ebook about what a career as a health coach might look like. You can find it all for free at kresser.co/discover. That's kresser.co/discover. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.